This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 616, entitled The Use of Masculist Hatred to Liberate Men. Description. This flyer explains why masculists use hatred as their primary tactic to liberate men. This hatred is both heartfelt and a deliberate political tactic that the masculists feel is more effective than the poor little me victim approach of the MRM, that's men's rights movement, or the apolitical wimpery of the MGTOWs, men going their own way. Flyer itself. The use of masculist hatred to liberate men, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer explains why masculists are explicitly hateful in expressing their masculist views. What is the benefit of being hateful? ? Is it not counterproductive, or does it actually benefit the masculists in their aim to liberate men? ? My own girlfriend, partner, with whom I have a LAT, living apart together relationship, is critical of my masculist expression of hatred against the enemies of the masculists. She keeps talking about my tone, that is, the hateful masculist tone, that she strongly dislikes, probably as a female, given her agreeableness-oriented female nature. This flyer spells out why masculists are explicitly hateful, showing the advantages to masculists relative to other branches of the manosphere, in brackets, that is, men who talk about men's issues on the internet, close brackets, in reaching and appealing to men to liberate themselves from the severe oppressions of the traditional man-slave role, working for decades for women in order to get some regular sex from a woman, a price that the masculists judge as excessive and no longer necessary. I'll start by saying that masculist expression of hatred against the oppressions that women exert on men are both emotionally heartfelt and is also a deliberate masculist strategy used to overcome the inferiorities of approaches taken by other branches of the manosphere, that's men's lib, to liberate men. For example, the MRM, that's men's rights movement, and the MGTOW, that's MGTOW, men going their own way. So why do masculists feel real hatred against gender criminal women who commit such horrible gender crimes against men that last decades? ? One only has to become familiar with the masculist arguments against the horrible gender crimes that women commit against men to hate those women, those gender criminal women. I've had the personal experience of talking for half an hour with a very bright woman, a full professor of history, on the main masculist ideas. Of course, these ideas were entirely new to her, but with her very smart mind and her deep historical sense, as a full professor of history, she absorbed the main ideas of the masculists very quickly and said to me that they made obvious sense and that from now on she was a female masculist. My own LAT girlfriend is less so. She has a partial understanding of the concept of divorce rate, in brackets, since she has 2 sons, that I will present shortly, and also thinks that women who force men into fathering a kid that the man never wanted in the first place is a crime by the woman. So she could be labelled a halfway house female masculist. But I think, given her nature, she instinctively winces at masculist expression of hatred, which makes me think that she has not yet fully understood masculist thinking and why masculist hatred is so natural to masculists, who take the common sense view that some things should be hated, in capital letters. For example, if I were a Palestinian, I would hate the Zionists for having stolen Palestinian land. If I were a Chinese, I would hate the Japs for what the Japs did to China in World War II. If I were a Russian, I would hate the Nazis for their invasion of Russia, also in World War II. Thus, the modern hate speech laws that have been implemented in many countries, I find mindlessly middle class and dumb. I think most sages, in brackets, that is, intellectuals, people who love playing with ideas, who think, who typically have an IQ in the top 1%, have a PhD, and who write books, close brackets, are critical and contemptuous of the hate speech laws, seeing them as a product of the mindless middle class, whose ability to manipulate ideas is grossly inferior compared to the sage class. One of the main reasons why masculists have such a hatred of the gender criminality of women against men is their masculist hatred of man's slavery, because masculists are abolitionists. To have your masculist consciousness raised means, essentially, that you see fluffydom as man's slavery, and man's slavery as slavery, and hence something to be hated and a war issue. Slavery has been with humanity for thousands of years and was considered perfectly normal. It was only in the past few centuries that Negro slavery, for example, was seen as a moral abomination. In the US, for example, political and intellectual agitation against Negro slavery really got off the ground in the 1830s, when a historical hero of mine, in brackets, William Lloyd Garrison, close brackets, launched his abolitionist newspaper, the Liberator, in 1831. His ideas spread and spread, especially in the Christian and Quaker communities, until such a hatred of Negro slavery grew in the northern states of the US that the southern states became alarmed, fearing that their very economic basis, that is, growing cotton, an industry that was based on Negro slavery, that was a huge export industry to Britain at the time, would be undermined by moral pressure from the North, from the Yankees. So when John Brown actually started killing Southern slavers of Negroes, the Southerners eventually seceded from the Union, from the United States, in brackets, of America, which was the main reason why Lincoln went to war with the South, to keep those states in the Union. Thus, in historical terms, the Negro slavery issue was the root cause of the US Civil War that ended up killing over 500,000 soldiers. Masculists see a close historical analogy between the US Civil War and the current masculist war against man's slavery, seeing it as literally 1,000 times bigger problem than was Negro slavery, given the numbers. There were several million Negro slaves in the US in the slave period, whereas there are several billion man slaves in the world today who work for women for decades of their lives as the price these men pay to get regular sex from a woman. A price that the masculists see as way too high, so are out to liberate men from man's slavery, that is, working for women for decades of men's lives, instead of doing what men want to do with their own lives, pursuing their own dreams and goals, rather than being a man's slave to a woman who expects him to work for her so she can raise her kids in a middle-class house that he pays for, keeping the whole family, that is himself, his parasitic wife and kids, financially afloat, which was the traditional role of the male, to be the breadwinner. The masculists are out to liberate men from this traditional man-slave role by putting tremendous moral pressure on women to FIP up. FIP, in brackets, equals financially independent person. to get a career competent education so that women can be FIPs as adults and share equally with men the burden of earning the living rather than being fluffies, in brackets, equals, traditional woman who expects to parasite off the money and labour of a man, leeching off him for decades, close brackets. Masculists have a hatred of fluffies, seeing them as man-slaving, divorce-raping vermin, and are at war against them, forcing them to die slow, miserable deaths by making them rot on the shelf, by being totally ignored by, in brackets, masculisted men. Not even pumped and dumped, so that fluffies die out, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and utterly rejected both socially and sexually by men, as most men become infected by the masculist virus. Masculists hate fluffies because they see fluffies as highly immoral parasites who don't bother to fib up and then expect to sexploit the labour and money of a man for decades of his life. Thus the masculist hatred of fluffies is heartfelt and very real. The main political aim of the masculists is to create a FIP society, where both sexes are socialised and educated to be FIPs, so that women pull their financial weight equally with men, and not manslave men, and not divorce rape men in the hated, that's by masculists, fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts, who are run by feminists who know nothing about masculist ideas, making these feminists, by definition, monoconscious, who have kept their traditional expectations of men, seeing men as cash machines who exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies. Masculists have an even greater hatred of fluffy feminists, since it's bad enough that they are fluffies and hence manslaving, divorce-raping parasites. They are also seen by masculists as hypocrites and genociders. Hypocrites, since these fluffy feminists want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men in the divorce courts by not expecting women to be FIPs, but rather as fluffies, who manslave and divorce rape men, making divorce such a shitty deal for men that now in many Western countries 2/3 of young men and growing refuse to marry, reject paternity and spend their money on themselves, that is, choosing to live the MGTOW, MGTOW, men going their own way lifestyle, which is crashing the birth rate. Thus the masculists see the fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts as indirect genociders who have to be stopped with bullets, if necessary, in a sex war. The fact that women are far from being fully FIP'd today has repercussions in the reproductive sphere. For example, one of the worst gender crimes that women commit against men is forced fathering, where women have the MARA, that's maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, but men don't have the PARA, which is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, which is a natural consequence of the traditional gender roles of the mother as housewife and the father as breadwinner. Masculists push hard for the legislation of the PARA and the OPTAB, O-P-T-A-B, that's obligatory paternity testing at birth, for all births, to block women's paternity fraud, where in about 10% of pregnancies, the husband is not the father, thus forcing the husband with no para to pay for decades for a kid that is, in capital letters, not even his. A major and hated gender crime by women against men. This is the end of part 1.